Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is a Ukraine war news update, third part thereof, busy day for this Saturday, for the 30th of March 2024. Someone was saying in the thread earlier that I look fresh today. Do you know why? It's because 2 days of no school for the boys. It's Saturday, and it was Good Friday yesterday, so no school, no alarm going off because my partner works in the school and she didn't have to go, and so no alarms going off, and that's brilliant. No football match this morning, that's brilliant. No rugby match tomorrow morning, that's brilliant. So I'll have no alarms going off. I'm going to have 3 days of doing this work, but with a more replenished look on my face. Anyway, that's enough nonsense. Let's get to the news. We are going to go first to Poland, where Ukraine had a delegation over the last few days. They're trying to solve the border issue, predominantly with the hauliers and the farmers blockading due to the EU tariffs or lack of tariffs on Ukrainian goods coming through the border and hitting the markets in Europe. There were high hopes for this to be sorted out, and the Ukrainian delegation went in, and apparently you had the deputy, I think, agricultural minister from Poland just going a bit mental, and it was all a little bit embarrassing. Ukrainian delegation ambushed in Warsaw as Polish official goes off the rails, according to Polish media. Kiev had high hopes for Thursday's negotiations aimed at clearing border blockaded by Polish farmers and easing Ukrainian farm exports to Poland. Just a little bit weird. He gave the impression of being under the influence of certain substances. He kept running out of the room, and when he returned, he would start attacking us with renewed force, said Alex Lisitsa, president of the Ukrainian Agribusiness Club that participated in the negotiations, according to Ukrainska Pravda. Polish Association representatives confirming Kolodziejczak's erratic behaviour to Onet remained anonymous, but one said he, quote, kept going in and out, reading his phone, doing anything but talking. Larger quote, when we were nearing the end of the negotiations and Polish Minister of Agriculture Sikierski briefly left the room, Michel, this chap who was acting erratically, suddenly lashed out at the representatives of the Ukrainian delegation. We know how Michel can behave, but for someone meeting him for the first time, it could have been a shock. It looked bad because after Kolodziejczak's performance, the thread of understanding was lost, commented one of the meeting's participants. The meeting was long, we were all tired, we're just human, said this chap in his own defence. And it was an attempt to discredit him. But yeah, that's a shame because that's a really important thing that needed solving, and it appears that the opportunity was lost. Now, Zelensky has moved on Alexei Danilov. If you remember, he was a former National Security and Defence Council Secretary. There was a rumour he was going to become ambassador to Norway. He's become ambassador to Moldova. Actually, this is a really important position, I would have thought, given Moldova's geographical location and its political situation at the moment with regard to Transnistria and Russia's involvement in Moldova and its attempts to look westward towards the EU while Russia is trying to keep it under its sphere of influence. So I don't know that Alexei Danilov wanted to be moved. I don't know what the background to this was, but actually that is an important position. I hope he can help. But yeah, certainly, as I've said in this morning's video, in the other section, that there have been a number of reshuffling movements of personnel under Zelensky. So hopefully this isn't a sign of larger malaise in the Zelensky administration, and it's just all normal kind of movement stuff. But, you know, time of war, things are stressful, stuff does go wrong. Right, Donald Tusk, war is no longer a concept from the past. Every scenario is possible. I'm not exaggerating. It's becoming more clear every day. Our duty is not to discuss, but to act and prepare for defence, he added. So Donald Tusk is really ramping up the rhetoric in terms of, and I reported this previously, this is actually just adding a bit of meat on the bones from yesterday, but he is certainly preparing Poland and Eastern Europe for a potential escalation of the conflict going forward. In the Guardian here says, in an interview with a group of European newspapers reported by the BBC, Tusk said, "I don't want to scare anyone, but war is no longer a concept from the past. As you just heard, it started over 2 years ago. True solidarity with Ukraine, less words, more ammunition," he wrote on social media earlier this month. In another post, he addressed Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. "How many more arguments do you need to take a decision?" Tusk wrote. So he is certainly becoming more and more explicit with where he thinks this war is going, how serious it is for Europe and indeed for Poland, and we have other nations following suit as well. I think the EU realizes, Macron realizes this. Olaf Scholz sort of he does realize it, but just doesn't want to give Taurus. Is there still this infiltration of the SPD? So I was talking previously yesterday about the influence that Russia is trying to have on Europe, particularly Europe's far right, and trying to foment discord and using immigration as a vehicle to do that, to stir up the far right that also have often have Eurosceptical viewpoints. And if you stir up the far right, then they will also want to leave EU because they'll blame the EU for migration. Because inside the EU and the Schengen area, you get free movement of people, and that, if immigrants can get into the EU from the border nations, then of course they can more easily move freely within that. And so therefore, if you are angry about immigration, then it's easy to find fault with the EU, and that's exactly what Russia wants to key into. And so therefore, I was saying yesterday that they're more likely to foment discord and support and amplify the views of the far right at the moment than the far left. But they do also work with some elements of the far left. So in Germany, with Der Link, or is it Wagenknecht? What's her name? Sarah. What's her name? Anyway, her new left-wing party is I think has those natural connections to the Russian way of thinking, but also the SPD. So Olaf Scholz's party. There's still a historical connection of that sort of centre-left party to Russia, and some of these politicians who are kind of anti-continued aid to Ukraine are coming from that left wing of the SPD party. And so it's not just the far right. I think it is far more the far right than the far left, but there are some places in Europe where Russia is trying to stir up those parties as well. It's just whatever can cause discord, basically. Russian network that paid European politicians is busted, authorities claim. So I reported on this largely yesterday, but I'm just going to return to it a little bit. It's being reported in mainstream media here, as you'd expect, BBC. Czech media, citing intelligence sources, reported that politicians from Germany, France, Poland, Belgium, Netherlands and Hungary were paid by Voice of Europe. So this is this almost a shell company, if you like, a front for the Kremlin. Voice of Europe, this supposed media entity, but in order to influence upcoming elections for the European Parliament. Poland's intelligence agency said it conducted searches in the Warsaw and Tychy regions and seized $48,500 and $36,000. Quote, money from Moscow has been used to pay some political actors who spread Russian propaganda, BIS said in a statement. It added that the sums amounted to millions of Czech crowns, tens of thousands of pounds. The alleged propaganda network, quote, aimed to carry out activities against the territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, BIS said. BIS did not name the politicians allegedly involved. However, Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo alleged they included members of the European Parliament. So I think we're going to see a lot more on this going forward. And indeed, members of the European Parliament have now demanded an investigation into Russia's alleged bribery of European politicians. According to the Czech Denik N publication, politicians could receive money from the Russian government in exchange for calls to stop aid to Ukraine, as we just seen from the BBC article. So this will rumble on, and I will keep an eye on it, because I think this is super important. This is an assault on European democracy. Just massively problematic. Right. One of my commenters here says, Jonathan, I appreciate that you as a Brit pick up these points. that we East Europeans and East Europe insiders are stressing and have been stressing for decades. It doesn't tell me who these people are particularly. This is SPX RAM, so thank you for that. So the Russians are on the all-out psyops and physical war against any democratic civilization since the KGB FSB retook power in 1999. There is also no reason to make any differentiation between far left and far right actors. Russians are pushing Palestinians into war and terrorism since 1960. Same with other Arabs as well. They only concentrate on. They've only concentrated since 1999 on the so-called far right because they understood that the communist idea will never have a majority in the West. This is what I'm saying. I think that this is opportunism. It's not necessarily a political alignment to the far right, although I think there is interesting. I was watching something on ethno-nationalism in Russia recently, and there is way more over ethno-nationalism in Russia. It was on Ukraine the Latest. They had a whole segment actually on that recently, and I think there is this. It's really odd that they are so anti-Nazi and anti-fascist supposedly, and yet within the culture within the society of Russia there are these huge Nazi movements, and so which they used actually rather cynically to some effect and have done for decades. But anyway, I digress. I think in terms of influence on Europe, it's easier to use the far right again because of particularly the immigration issue. So they both use these actors as their agents, or both these actors as their agents. In Germany, AfD is taking the fascist role, and Linke, as I said, Linke, and especially BSW taking the communist role. Their most useful agent currently is a leftist SPD actor, Rolf Mützenich. This is true. So he is one of these, as I said, the SPD guy that's sitting on the left, head of the SPD Parliament faction, who in person is responsible for stopping the tourist delivery. In MAGA Mike's similar role, he blocks certain government decisions. So yeah, it's not only the right, but I just think it is more so. Now, somebody was saying in response to this investigation that I was telling you about when I was talking about it yesterday. So this is Deeb here talking about the Belgian Philippe de Winter and Philippe Brusselmans, these two Belgians who are connected to the Voice of Europe network, and he was talking about this Belgian far right party, and he was. I mean, you can pause the video and read this whole thing. I'm not going to read all of it; it's quite in depth. But I really appreciate the information that you guys give me when you do write these thoughtful comments. Although I always had to remember this is just one person's view and it is not representative of a Belgian view in general. But interesting to put, as I say, more flesh on the bone for my understanding of Belgian politics and about this Flemish secessionist movement, right? And if you read books like, what was it? I think Blowout, Rachel Maddow's Blowout, which is a very good book about the hydrocarbons industry and fracking in the US and its connection to Russia. You may or may not like Rachel Maddow, but that book is superb. And if you want to get because the book ends up going in a direction that I wasn't expecting to, which was spending an awful lot of time talking about Russia and Russia's influence in the hydrocarbons industry and on and with disinformation. And one of the things she talks about is their disinformation, their troll farms working on, say, the Texas secessionist movement, which is like some small kind of almost irrelevant movement that some people believe in America, but then amplifying that and throwing it in and then fueling it, and it just sows extra discord. Or here we have a secessionist movement because of course, you maybe, as a Belgian, I think this guy is actually a secessionist, like is a fan of that, but with that will probably come a desire to get out of Europe. If you want like independence, and if you want to shout about your own particular cultural place and your own identity, then it's more likely that you'll be against being subsumed into a larger federal state. And so if you are a secessionist in Belgium, a Flemish secessionist, you are likely to be anti-EU more than not. And so therefore, this is perfect as a movement for Russia to get behind, for their troll farms to get behind, in the same way that's the case with the Texas secessionists. Anyway, he said, but in the people he's spoken to in that party, which is it Vlaams, what's it called? Vlaams Belang Party, which is the one that's been, these two people have been associated with, who have got connections to Russia. He says, in my humble opinion, the far right in Belgium has become more moderate in recent past and hasn't been infiltrated by Russian agents, or nowhere near the same level as with MAGA Republicans in the US. The Russian goal is not necessarily to fund the far right, but to find anyone willing to speak out with a different or Russian propaganda aligned opinion. And I'd agree with this. Philip de Winter and Philip Brusselmans have been used as cheap tools for the Kremlin, even if they spoke with a genuine set of ideas. So what he's saying is, look, these guys and their beliefs about Polish political positioning and topics, they're fine. I don't disagree with them, but they are being amplified by Russia. And this is what I was saying yesterday, that it's difficult because you end up almost throwing out the baby with the bathwater by saying, well, Russia have got behind these people and these ideas, and therefore these ideas are all nonsense. Well, that's not necessarily the case. They are opportunistically amplifying them because they know that those ideas are divisive in a larger political landscape. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm obviously going to disagree with those on the far right generally, right? So I'm going to say that those ideas aren't cool. But just because they're supported by Russia doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't cool. It just means that they're easier to be weaponized. Philip de Winter, have been, and Brusselmans have been used as cheap tools by the Kremlin, even if they spoke with a genuine set of ideas. I myself stress my concern to the Vlaams Belang Party about their members being lured or used as propaganda mouthpieces, even if they never intended to be one. The question now is, will this newer generation of right-wing politicians be able to keep their integrity together and act in the interests of Europe and not on the behest of authoritarian figures? And so, there's lots more in this to do with him speaking to people in the party and actually them being basically anti-Russian. And so he doesn't quite, there is this disconnect between these people who have been used as useful tools by the Russians and other people on the ground. But anyway, you get the idea. These things are complicated. I think it's worth understanding, in terms of the left and right. Left and right, I just want to reiterate my position. Left and right is a pretty much defunct tool to understand politics, and I use it more often than not because everyone kind of understands where I'm coming from. But with the left and right, you get an authoritarian left and an authoritarian right that are joined in their desire for authoritarianism, whether that be dictatorial communism or dictatorial fascism. It was really interesting that yesterday, and this is how I don't want to use this as an opportunity to slag off Trump, but Trump was talking about how all these enemies and like these fascists, these communists, and he put them together as if they're the same things. Like, do you not understand that? So, the Democrats are fascists and they're communists. And you need to get rid of them. So what are you? Are you a centrist now? Is Donald Trump the ultimate centrist? Anyway, just another example. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Authoritarian left, authoritarian right. But then you get libertarian left and libertarian right. And so, like, the left and right doesn't do a good job of describing where we all sit, politically speaking. And in fact, what I advise everyone goes to the politicalcompass.org and takes a test to see where they sit on the political compass. I did mine. Goodness me, this is going back many, many years, right? But this is where I was, 8 years ago or something. I need to do it again. I probably will have shifted. But I was kind of centre-left in libertarian and economic way. So this is your economic left right, and this is your authoritarian libertarian, so your personal freedoms. So I am like, I'm all for personal freedoms, and you can do whatever you like in the sexual moral domain. It doesn't bother me unless it's like overtly morally impugns others or interferes with other people. But behind closed doors, you do what you like. And I'm very morally progressive. I'm centre left. Economically, I understand that capitalism is the least worst system, but I also think it needs to be regulated sensibly. So I believe in like the old school British mixed economy, and because free market will go wrong if you allow it to just do its own thing. It will feed those who are greedy, and is not interested in morality. I've written very long essays on this, so I won't bore you now. But the free market cannot arbitrate for morality. Is a simple point. So in order to arbitrate for morality, when you're talking politically and economically, you need to get an intervention of the government. The question is, how far do you allow the government to intervene? So someone on the communist left will have the government strategically planning everything, right? And someone on the free market extreme right, economically speaking, will have absolutely no intervention and no government at all. And I'm somewhere in the middle there, although it says here that I'm sort of the centre left. Right. I actually believe that people I know who have been quite right-wing have taken this end up only being over here. I don't know anyone that's actually been right over here. So I think it skews slightly into looking like this as a quadrant. But nonetheless, it's much better to understand people in the quadrant rather than just the left-right, because you have the authoritarian left and the authoritarian right sharing quite a lot, but they're not sharing other ideas as well. So, just anyway, that's my aside. Now, the ex-Austrian security officer who spied on in Austria on an investigative journalist called Christo Grozev for Jan Marsalek and the FSB has finally been arrested. So this is the Austrians, of course, being somewhat, I mean, they're neutral technically, but there are some strong connections to Russia inside Austria. He told the FSB he sold the FSB data from smartphones of 3 top Austrian officials, stolen while the devices were being repaired for water damage. So that is happening. We have this problem. I've got this somewhere else as well. I can't find. I haven't got it up here. There are lots of reports coming out that Russia is able to import explosives much more in terms of quantity of explosives to make their weaponry with Western help. So American, German and Taiwanese firms have made nitrocellulose, which is a key ingredient in propellant for artillery, that was shipped to Russia via a Turkish intermediary to evade sanctions. In fact, it's probably a good time to pop into to go to, well, Erdogan is meeting Biden at the White House. I wonder if stuff like this will come out. Politicians are likely to discuss the transfer of US F-16 aircraft to Turkey and Ankara's role in circumventing sanctions against Russia. So there you go. And actually, talking of sanctions, the EU has imposed a ban on Turkish airlines, Southwind Airlines, from flying through Europe because of its connections to Russia. But yeah, Russia is importing lots of things in increased quantities from lots of places where they shouldn't be able to, and it is allowing them to prosecute the war. Right, listen to this. It's only like 10 seconds worth, just for shits and giggles.
Our government at the same time is funding a war that most people do not support in a country that no one can find on a map hardly. And
no one can find this guy. She's projecting, of course. No one can find this on a map. We all know where bloody Ukraine is. It is just south of Toronto and Michigan and just southeast of New York. I mean, everyone knows where Ukraine is. It's slap bang. I mean, Cincinnati's in Ukraine, right? I mean, she's just tarring everyone with her ignorant brush. Of course we know where Ukraine is. In all seriousness, right, there is a worry about Mike Johnson still. This thing is rolling on, and I flip-flop all over the place with what I think is going on in Mike Johnson's head. But somebody sent me this, actually. House is to send impeachment articles to Senate next month. So senators are then expected to be sworn in and seated as a jury the next day. What is going on here? So House Speaker Mike Johnson announced on Thursday, so rather than worrying about what's going on with Ukraine and saying, we need to get this Ukraine bill to the floor and we need to vote on it, he's worrying himself with sending impeachment articles against Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Now, whatever you think about Mayorkas, he has not done anything that's impeachable, right? What Republicans are annoyed about is stuff to do with border issues and immigration. And at most, it's ineptitude. But it's not impeachable. This is, again, a crusade that is absolutely unwarranted and unjustified. But if you're going to worry people about this, you are deflecting away from Ukraine. And again, I'm now swinging back to Mike Johnson is a plum tool, and he's not interested one bloody iota about getting Ukraine aid to Ukraine. He might say it, and we'll just come to what someone else thinks about him, and actually thinking that he will. But I don't know if this is what they're going to be sorting out as soon as they come back from recess, before they go on another recess. I believe just after that, then. This is not good news for Ukraine. It just really isn't. And it's what Mike Johnson has clearly announced. So this is a problem. Now, some of you might know good old Carville here. So James Carville is a Democratic strategist who... is he from Louisiana? Typical sort of deep South guy, but very Democratic. But this is his opinion on Mike Johnson.
I filed the motion to vacate today, but it's more of a warning and a pink slip. Let's take our time and find a new Speaker of the House that will stand with Republicans and our Republican majority instead of standing with the Democrats.
Have you ever seen anything like this, and will it matter in November, or does it get sort of clouded out?
I'm not a big Mike Johnson guy. I'm highly critical of Mike Johnson. But
I have watched James Carville videos of him taking apart Mike Johnson's Christian nationalism, wanting to separate church and state, wanting to take apart the separation of church and state. So James Carville is not a fan of Mike Johnson at all. He's underplaying how much he despises him here.
seeing her kind of makes me like him more. Like, okay, I don't agree with you on anything, but I mean, the way that they're just jumping all over this guy is unbelievable. And I mean, in his defense, he's got a 1 or 2 vote margin here. But you know, so this Ukraine bill has got to get moving, man. And there's a lot of stuff that's got to get done, and people like Congresswoman Green that want to stand in the way of it. And I think the public doesn't like it. I'm pretty confident about that.
Do you think Democrats can get more out of this? There's a lot of talk that you only have a few more months of even possible legislating, then you're in the thick of the campaign. But he really needs Democrats on big things.
Well, he does, and it's not just can the Democrats get through it, can the Ukrainians get through it, can the Polish get through it, can the Slovenians get through it, can the Romanians get through it? I mean, there's a really big deal going over there. And, you know, this is a terrible thing to say, but Putin, you know, there are people in the United States Congress that are pro-Putin. To me, that's treasonous. It's just what it is. I mean, it's called what it is, Yeah. And you're seeing that. And I think that I disagree with Mike Johnson about everything you could imagine, but I think at his core he's a patriot. I hope.
I think that's really interesting. So his views that like there are treasonous people in the Congress that are pro-Putin. Like, what is going on there? So that's one thing. I don't like Mike Johnson on anything, but at core, I think he's a patriot and he will do the right thing. And that's kind of where I've been recently. Pretty much exactly what he's just said, indeed. But then you get someone like Jasmine Crockett here, who is a really forthright, a very good politician sitting on the oversight committee from Texas. She's from St. Louis. She represents Texas, and she's a former criminal lawyer, and you can see that coming through. There's been lots of viral videos of her absolutely on fire, I think, in the oversight committee hearings. But the question about would you support Mike Johnson if he was to have the motion to have his seat vacated, right? As a Democrat, would you stop him being vacated to try and get stuff like Ukraine aid through? And this is her response.
Her name twice in this interview, but Marjorie Taylor Greene, she threatened to oust Speaker Johnson recently. There's been some debate over whether Democrats should vote for Speaker Johnson to save his job in return for some concessions. What do you think of that idea? And is there like a wish list that Democrats should fight for?
I think that you can count on me to be a no for MAGA Mike no matter what. So just watch the board. You won't find Congresswoman Crockett saving MAGA Mike.
Which is interesting, right? Because she then goes on to give an absolute, extolling the virtues of supporting Ukraine. But even given that, like, MAGA Mike is that divisive, and yet these other MAGA politicians see him as not MAGA enough now, and he's known as MAGA Mike to these people. Now, she deals with him quite a lot, and she just has absolutely no time for him, again, on anything. Yeah, so
Now,
that doesn't bode well for him being supported if he did table the Ukraine aid.
leadership decides to do, maybe with some of our frontline members and things like that, people in districts other than mine, I think that we leave those negotiations up to leadership. I think,
which is, so just to translate all this, so what this might come down to is Democratic leadership saying, right, we need to work out what districts you're in, and if you're in a really safe Democrat district, then you don't need to support Mike Johnson, or you do need, it's depending on what, you can support him because you'll still get voted in. If you're not, then, or whichever way round, but there'll be some people who will be voting with their hearts and minds, and other people voting because actually the Democratic leadership has said, we really need you to vote to support Mike Johnson, because actually if we don't, he'll get, it could be worse in the long run.
that you don't get something for nothing.
Right.
For sure.
Sure hope not,
and,
yeah.
and I mean, we've been getting kind of scraps. I mean, it's like, oh, you can pass a budget finally 6 months later. Like, really? Like, seriously? It's like, oh, okay, well, we'll vote to keep the government open. Really? Like, we should be doing, like, these are, it's bare minimum that
Crazy,
we're getting, for sure. But, we used to live in a time where you could expect, in a very bipartisan way, that when it came to matters of national security, and foreign affairs, for the most part, we'd pretty much be on a similar page. I mean, the difference was, Democrats have never really cared for how bloated our defense budget has been, because we bloat defense, and then non-defense, which is everything that takes care of everyday people, is always like getting the scraps, right? Like, and trying to bring some parity to that, especially since, defense can't seem to ever pass an audit. But I will tell you, as it relates to Ukraine, I am very concerned, and it's not just for the Ukrainians. It is legitimately for the world. We're talking about Russia potentially having access to a nuclear plant that's in Ukraine, either being able to take that over or potentially destroying it and causing harm environmentally in that way. Not to mention, the idea of allowing Putin to be emboldened further is problematic, not just for us, but for the world. And so, the idea that we can't unite around going after or pushing back on Putin is a problem. Not to mention, I don't know how many people really understand that if Putin decides, okay, I've got Ukraine, now where do I move? And he moves into a NATO country. And for people that don't understand what a NATO country is, and I know that Trump is talking about pulling us out of NATO, but that is also a very dumb idea.
Yeah.
That means that your mothers, your brothers, your sisters, your uncles, your aunts, your children, they then have to suit up and go into war. So when people are talking about the cost, we have a monetary cost of helping Ukraine, but we may end up having monetary as well as American lives that are lost if we don't nip this in the bud right now. And so it's very crucial, and this is going to hit home really hard. And, people see the big numbers and they're like, oh, that's a lot of money. They can do something else with the money. It's not really how the budget works. You're either on this side of the ledger or that side of the ledger. If they don't spend it on this war, they're going to spend it on something else, this defense. It's not going to somehow come over to the other side of the ledger. Right. And I really am just concerned about our national security, and I really want them to take it seriously. So this is not a win for Democrats. This is a win for Americans, Ukrainians, and honestly, the rest of the world. So absolutely, we should take up the supplemental. I don't know that we would ever have too much of a fight, as it's not been talked about, over funding for Taiwan. There seems to be bipartisan support for Taiwan, because
and we're going to speak about that. And she goes on to speak about Taiwan, and then to speak about Israel, and saying, well, Israel is an interesting one with certain Democrats, and so absolutely true. So, but what was interesting there is that she started off with no, I would not support Mike Johnson, but I do support the supplemental. And the question is, well, if supporting Mike Johnson is the only way of getting a supplemental, where do you stand on that? That's the question I would like to have seen pressured on her. But I've got a lot of time for her with regard to all the things she talked about in this whole interview, but particularly with Ukraine, she recognises the importance of Ukraine and is talking the correct talk on Ukraine, where people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are just wing nuts that have absolutely no idea. And then when it comes to Taiwan, China's can't take Taiwan unless Russia, Iran and North Korea win in Ukraine. Well, that's what Jane Keefe says here. So New York Times runs a piece. Taiwan's top diplomat says US aid to Ukraine is critical for deterring China. So this idea that some Republicans use, I don't know, it was used much more widely. I haven't heard it so much recently, but the idea that we shouldn't be spending money on Ukraine, we should be spending that money instead on China. China's our real big issue, our real big threat, and Taiwan is where we need to concentrate that funding. Well, actually, if the Taiwanese are saying, actually, no, you don't, you need to concentrate that funding on Ukraine, because if Ukraine wins against Russia, then China ain't doing squat against us, at least not in the short term. So really interesting that that's been said by Taiwan's top diplomat there. Then we get back to, I was going to go into Turkey, but we said that now. Move on to US, Japan and the Philippines. So talk about China and Taiwan. But of course, I talk about this in terms of, everything being connected, both in terms of funding, but also in terms of actually what happens geopolitically. US, Japan and Philippines to begin joint naval patrols in South China Sea to counter China. Now, remember, I was talking about how the Philippines are aligned to the US. The US has many military bases in the Philippines due to Second World War legacy. And the Chinese have been encroaching on the Philippines in general. And there's been these Coast Guard vessels have been attacked by Chinese Coast Guard vessels, hitting them with water cannons that I showed you the other day. Well, now the US, Japan and Philippines are getting together to kind of flex a little bit. The decision comes amid escalating territorial disputes between China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia and Brunei over the Spratly archipelago. China's foreign ministry has said Chinese forces, quote, will threaten to take strong steps to protect its territorial interests. And China is involved in building islands, literally building islands up, reclaiming land in a sense from these kind of atoll areas, and then building airstrips and ports and bases on them. They are very much using that neck of the woods very strategically, and the question is, well, what are these other nations doing about that? Anyway, something else to get yourselves worried about. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Let me know what you think. I know I spend a lot of time talking about the US political scene because it is that important. As Zelensky said, without the US aid, we will retreat. So the reason I have to talk about US politics so much is because it directly affects the outcome of the war in Ukraine, as according to Ukraine's president. So we will talk about Mike Johnson and the Republican-Democrat interactions for as long as it takes until that aid bill goes through. May that happen soon. Toodle pits.